Alrighty. So I took a couple of days off, because I thought the world was ending for a minute there. But since we're all still alive and hopefully healthy enough, I figured it's time for me to get back to my desk and give you guys your daily dose of corporate Nintendo criticism. Especially because, well, over this last weekend, you could be fooled into thinking that things were looking like nothing but up for the big end. After all, going into the weekend, we saw a trailer that showed that Pokemon officially might have reached PS3 level graphics, although I've seen some games that look better on the PS3. And the way that they've been talking about Resident Evil Requiem, you'd think a majority of people decided to buy it on the Switch too. Now, these points have given Nintendo fans a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They're walking around twirling their Pikachu Labubu, talking about how the haters and grifters are silenced and there's no way they can show their face in public again. And then, Pokemon Pokopia all of a sudden is getting an 89 rating on Metacritic, and oh boy, all of a sudden, now they care about scores. Unfortunately, however, games are not priced according to scores. If it's a low-budget title, it should not be $70, especially when it's on a game keycard. Whether or not it is a good game doesn't change that. That being said, I wish Nintendo would price their games based off of the scores that they're getting, because that way, a majority of their first-party Switch 2 titles would have been immediately released at a 20% discount, minimum. But obviously, Pokemon Pokopia is going to set a very bad precedent. Not to completely retrace my previous videos on the topic, but it is effectively normalizing game keycards for first-party titles, normalizing the $70 price tag for low-budget games, and for game keycards for that matter. And while the review score may help the game a little bit, the fact of the matter is whether this title was a 5 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, the Pokemon fandom would have made sure this game was a phenomenal success. But I still think, similar to Kirby Air Riders, this thing will be a much bigger success in Japan than it is in the West. We'll see how that goes. Now, prior to the weekend, and prior to the reviews of Pokemon Pokopia, while I decided to take a weekend off, somebody a lot more notorious than I am, someone that actually has credibility and has been in the industry for a very long time, randomly woke up and decided he was going to spoil the weekend of every single Nintendo fan online. Because on Saturday, seemingly out of nowhere, he decided to tweet that the Switch 2's first January is around 20% down in the US compared with the Switch 1. This, of course, comes from Chris Dring of the game business. Now, you might remember Chris Dring as the man that said the holiday sales for the Nintendo Switch 2 in the USA was 35% down, and then immediately following that, every single Nintendo fan went on a hate tirade against him, questioning his validity and his knowledge, and assuming that he isn't in the know even though he actually has contacts that work in Nintendo senior employees, because of course he does. And even though not too long after that, his numbers were 100% completely confirmed by Circana once we got the data through them, there still is a reluctancy amongst the Nintendo fandom to discredit Chris Dring because, well, he speaks the truth, and that bothers them. Now, as far as our calculations go, the estimates that I had done when there was January numbers a few weeks ago was that I had the assumption that they were somewhere between 150,000 units sold and 200,000 units sold. I think the optimistic Nintendo fans online were hovering around the 185 to 190,000-ish. My prediction was around 160-ish, it ends up being at 173,000. So now if we look at this chart over here that shows the Switch 1 versus the Switch 2 both starting in their respective Junes of their launch year, we see that the Nintendo Switch 2 up in its first January, in comparison to the Switch 1's first January, is behind by just under 600,000 units, which is about 100,000 more than last month. Now, of course, this table specifically is not launches aligned, but it does give you an idea of the slowdown. By the time the Nintendo Switch 1 reached the end of June, it only had sold 1.573 units, whereas the Switch 2 in its first month was at already 1.6 million units. So by the end of June, the Nintendo Switch 2 had already surpassed everything that the Switch 1 did, even though it was on the market longer. Obviously, that's what having stock available gets you. But after June, when the Switch 2 had a lead, through July, August, September, October, and November, the Switch 2 still led. By the time we got to December and we saw the poor holiday season, followed by January where it's another poor month, the massive Nintendo Switch 2 lead has swept away. But if you prefer to look at launches aligned charts, the Nintendo Switch 2 would have to sell at least 150,000 units over the next 2 months to maintain its lead when its launches aligned through the first 10 months. This is probably just about doable. By the time they get to their first 10 months, they should be just about tied. But after that are months April and May for the Switch 2, which are historically fairly slow months, and they would need to average roughly 280,000 units across each each of those months in order to finish its first 12 months faster than the Nintendo Switch 2. And seeing as how the total sales from November through January show that the Switch 2 was selling at least 35 to 40% slower, unless that rate takes a dramatic turn, the Switch 2 will not finish its first year doing better through the first 12 months than the Switch 1 did in the USA. So we'll have to see how that goes. Now, of course, him pulling out sales data tends to upset some people. It's funny because I see these same users on Twitter replying to him, and some of them are the same ones that comment on my videos, and they comment the same types of questions. Thankfully, there are other users on the platform that will answer on their behalf. One user also points out that it seems like third-party support isn't pushing the system in the US as much as Japan. Likely will need the usual Zelda and Pokemon mainline games to get better reach in the US. And I think that kind of ties into the next talking point. Because Chris Dring was not done yet. I'm telling you, I don't know what this guy's deal was, but he just decided, hey, I want to anger obsessive Nintendo fans this weekend. Keep up the great work, Chris. Not, angering Nintendo fans. Just share the data that you have. The more transparency, the better. I prefer it a lot more than when Circana comes out and releases data and is just like, keeps it as vague as possible and delivers it in a way to seem like it's positive when they're saying the same thing. Right, like when the holiday season was 35% down for the Nintendo Switch 2 in comparison to the first year of the Nintendo Switch 1. Instead of talking about how weak of a holiday season that was for the Nintendo Switch 2, for November, the Circana headline said that the Switch 2 plus the Switch 1 were only 10% down in comparison to the Switch 1 last year, because that 10% down makes it look a lot softer than the 35% down in comparison to the first year of the Switch 1's life, which would be a much more realistic comparison that you should be making. Or for example, in December, where the Switch 2 once again had a 35 or a 40% difference in comparison to the Switch 1's first year, instead the data highlighted by Circana was that it is 35% ahead of the PlayStation 4 over the same time window, and it's the fastest selling home console in US history. This is obviously a headline meant for damage control, largely because Nintendo is Circana's client, and it completely glosses over just how poor that December was by ignoring the fact that the Nintendo Switch 2, A, was not the fastest selling console in history because the Game Boy Advance had already surpassed it, and B, was the only console in its first 8 months, aside from the Game Boy Advance, that actually reached its first holiday season. I have a chart over here too, if you want to look at the comparisons as to why the Switch 2 is still ahead of the PS4 for now. But the point is, while Matt Piscatella seems to be really tiptoeing around the way that he's delivering the data of the Switch 2's poor months, including this last January where he did not specify how poorly the Switch 2's sales were, the information we're getting from Chris Dring is a lot more straightforward. The estimates are that they are 20% down in January. And it's expected that that's 20% down, accounting for the fact that it was a 4-week January versus the 2018's 5-week January. So technically, January to January comparison is closer to like 35% down, but it's with an extra week, but that stuff all bounces out later on anyway. In any case, like I said, Chris Dring was not done yet. Last night, he had a very interesting tweet. He's been fascinated to see how Resident Evil Requiem would fare on the Switch 2. The UK physical data is in, and it hasn't done huge numbers on the Switch 2. Oh, that's interesting, because based off of the marketing we've seen for this game and based off of the way people have been glazing it online, you would assume that most people's console of choice for this game was the Nintendo Switch 2. Now, in fairness, Resident Evil Requiem did do better than Mario Tennis Fever, but Mario Tennis Fever, as I've covered extensively on this channel, has had perhaps the worst launch out of every single Nintendo Switch 2 released first-party game. Mario Tennis Fever, by all accounts, should be considered a flop based off of how poorly it's doing in comparison to its previous title, and in comparison to every other Switch 2 game, especially when you consider that pretty much across the board, software sales are down for the Switch 2. But for some reason, not enough people are talking about this. So obviously, Resident Evil Requiem managed to surpass Mario Tennis Fever. It's a very low bar. In fact, it launched about as well as Cyberpunk, but the Switch 2 user base is about 5 times larger now than it was when Cyberpunk launched. So Resident Evil on the Nintendo Switch 2 did not have a very good launch, at least according to this very early data. Now you might say it's only the UK, but we've seen the same patterns all last year where one thing in Europe is pretty much reflective through most of the Western markets. And not only that, the United Kingdom is currently the largest market for Nintendo in Europe because in France, they all just gave up on the console. And that was a very big reason why we saw so many very heavy discounts for the Nintendo Switch 2 in France before any other country last year. So while you might shrug it off and assume that it's only the UK, I'll tell you what, it's not. And you're gonna see that as we get more data. And keep in mind, Resident Evil Requiem had a phenomenal launch. It had a much bigger UK physical launch than RE4 Remake and RE Village. Capcom has done it again. Those are Christopher Dring's words. So it had a huge success regardless of the Nintendo Switch 2. The Switch 2 data in this regard was negligible. And this is amplified by the fact that these are the retail numbers. This doesn't even include digital. And digital for every other platform, PC, Xbox, and Sony, is a lot more favorable than the digital sales that are going to be coming on Nintendo. So the retail numbers are the most optimistic numbers that will show for the Switch 2 in comparison to everything else. Look, here's another fun one. This user, clearly a Paramount White Knight in defense of the Nintendo sphere, tells Chris Dring, "This is my entire issue with how you frame narratives. It's why people question how you share information. Are you now claiming it did not outsell Xbox, or are you trying to downplay the comparison?" Basically, this person is attacking Chris Dring because the Switch 2 outsold the Xbox for sales of Resident Evil Requiem at retail, if you include the Generations pack. So Chris, who has a lot more patience for this stuff than I do, replied that it's irrelevant. It varies on the game, but broadly speaking, Xbox is a 90% digital platform, Switch is 20 to 30% digital platform. In terms of physical sales, the Switch 2 version of RE Requiem outsold the Xbox version. It wasn't a huge difference, but it did sell more. But we know the vast majority of Xbox game sales are downloaded, way more than the Switch games are. So yes, Resident Evil Requiem sold more as a physical game on the Switch 2 than Xbox. But no, Resident Evil Requiem did not sell more on the Switch 2 than Xbox overall. It won't even be close. And of course it won't. This is something that's been driving me crazy through like most of the Switch 2's life so far. Nintendo fans work off of vibes. They feel like every single game now is going to be the big digital shift. They feel like because they buy only digital and those around them on Reddit also buy only digital. And they think that the people that still buy physical and they hate game keycards, they think they're outdated and they're the minority, where in actuality, you're in your own bubble if you think that any third-party game, number one, is going to do gangbusters on the Switch 2, especially when it's a high-caliber AAA game that works much better on any other hardware. And number two, you assume that suddenly the digital splits must be so much higher for the Switch 2 than they ever were. While yes, the Switch 2 might lean more towards digital than the Switch 1 did, it is still very far away than everything else in the industry. That is why there has been such a big uproar about the game key cards, because physical still matters in the Nintendo circles. But I digress. And we actually saw it this morning with the UK charts. Resident Evil Requiem launches at number 1. Over half of that, this is again just retail, is PS5, 54%. PC takes up 36%. What are you even buying at retail for the PC? A code in a box with a steel box? Even that did better than the Switch 2. Xbox, a console that favors digital a lot more than physical, 6%. And Switch 2, a console that favors physical a lot more than anything else on this list, 4%. Now they separated the Resident Evil Generation Pack, which allows you to buy 3 games, and this was a Switch 2 exclusive. If that was included with the point number 1, the Switch 2 would have bumped up a few percent and passed by the Xbox. So it would probably be sitting around 7 or 8%. But obviously, as soon as you add digital to that mix, it's going to be a lot lower. But don't take my word for it, these are not my assumptions. There are 71 comments under this post from Chris Dring, because of course the Nintendo fans had to turn up. First comment is this user making the assumption that Cyberpunk Switch 2 version has been a huge success. Chris Dring replies with a GIF. Like, look, it's not a failure, but we know that the Switch 2 sales are down. We've broken it down. We've gotten financials. We see how poorly third-party games are doing. You don't go based off of vibes, you go based off of numbers. Somebody commented how it compared to Xbox at retail, but as Christopher Dring points out in the reply, Xbox is a much more digital platform. So yeah, it did more on the Switch 2, but after you include the digital splits, it will paint a very different picture. Another user comments, are Switch 2 game sales generally disappointing at the moment anyway? And Chris Dring says in terms of third party, it's quite slow at the moment. Then here's a little tip based off of all of the headlines, it's been slow since the console launched. And I think this is a very healthy conversation to have because this is the second major third-party release after Final Fantasy a month ago, where all of the headlines are talking about games being sold out. And this discussion about physical copies being sold out everywhere you look does not mean that the game sold a lot of copies. What it means is that Square and now Capcom are undershipping the physicals. Because, in my opinion, it's because they're trying to push as many people towards digital as possible. You ship out enough physical copies where it sells just about as well as the the worst performing Switch 2 Mario Tennis game, read around how well 7-year-old Switch 2 edition titles are going for $80, then you sell out all of those, you fool people into thinking that it's doing phenomenally because it's sold out everywhere, and you bank on that FOMO to get even more people to buy the game digitally. So the Switch 2 may have sold out, but it sold a 13th of what the PlayStation 5 did in retail. Of course, this is based off of the UK alone, so the amount that it's sold out is very much inconclusive. But we've had data for third-party games and for software sales for the Nintendo Switch 2 since the console launched until now, and there is no reason to believe it's a different pattern with Requiem than we saw with all of the titles before it. Even if Requiem ends up being the best-selling third-party game on the Nintendo Switch 2 so far, it will still be an irrelevant proportion of the total sales for the game. Because the reality is, when it comes to third-party games in particular, they can all be played better elsewhere. Even the supposed inferior version on the Xbox Series S runs at a stable frame rate. A stable frame rate of 60 frames per second, something that the Switch 2 with all of its DLSS is incapable of achieving. And since the game is priced as high as it is on the Nintendo Switch 2, it makes very little sense for people to go out of their way to play it on the Switch 2 when they have better hardware. Even with the Generations Pack that gives you the other 2 Resident Evil games for a little bit more money, people are still finding it to not be worth it to play it on the Switch 2 because they want to play it with the proper experience and not with frame bounces that go down to the 30s and 40s, or even into the 20s if you're on handheld. And of course, like I said, this is only based off of the UK for now, but Western markets have been fairly consistent. We'll have to see if that continues to be the case. Especially because at the end of the day, this is still a game that's on a game keycard, and the Nintendo environment still tends to favor physical. So the fact that it's on a game keycard might not necessarily be the reason that it's flopping, but it is certainly not helping the situation. On the opposite side, it's actually making it worse. To what extent? I don't know. I still think it's more because of the fact that it's a third-party game, and why would you pay the same amount of money for an inferior product? Because the Switch 2 experience on every single one of these third-party games is an inferior experience. Besides, if game keycards mattered that much, we'd probably be expecting very poor sales for Pokopia. But on the contrary, Pokopia is going to do very well because it is a first-party game. And first-party games are the only reason people buy Nintendo consoles. Hopefully there are enough people that are excited for Pokopia to get some of the dust off of all of these Switch 2s that are out there in Western markets. I guess we will find out soon enough. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.